everyone, thanks for tuning in to Stacker Chats. I'm Gina and I'm joined by Muneeb, Stack's founder. Stacks is a Bitcoin L2, and in these chats, we connect on recent happenings around Bitcoin and Bitcoin layers. So it's been a while, Muneeb. It is a whole new year, and I'm curious, in terms of the time that has passed, what does the world need to know about Bitcoin layers, especially in a critical year for Bitcoin with the upcoming halving?
Yeah, I think 2023 was definitely one of the best years for Bitcoin that I've experienced, and one of the years that I've been the most excited in. Almost like a revival of Bitcoin building, and that's just amazing to see. So I think in terms of Bitcoin L2s, I would say if you just rewind the clock a year, go back to even late 2022, I mean, we were talking about it, like we were excited, and we were sort of like pushing our thesis forward, but there was a lot of resistance, right? Like either people were not paying attention, or they're sort of like not that excited about the idea. They're like, hey, why would people want to do these things on Bitcoin when it's harder? All of that stuff, right? And I think the biggest change that I've noticed over the year, and I'm sure some of the work that we've done has played a role in it, is the emergence of Bitcoin L2s as a category, right? And that is really exciting to see, right? So I think over the last 2-3 months, I've seen independent players. These could be research organizations, or large sort of like funds, or other sort of like thought leaders in the space, put out like their own version of a Bitcoin L2 thesis. And I think when you see so many of them come out, like a new category starts to emerge, and that has been really amazing to see. So now I think we are not alone. I still think the category is relatively small compared to like Ethereum L2s or the alt L1s. Whereas I personally think that there is a lot more room for growth over here. Just to put some numbers here, if Bitcoin is at $1 trillion, which it already is today, right? Bitcoin has a lot of room to grow from here. Bitcoin L2s should be like 100 billion type of a market, right? And I think right now we are sitting at maybe like 3 billion. So I think there is a lot of room for growth, and we're seeing other projects, right? So it's only a market when there are independent teams that are coming in, independent capital is moving in, new teams are getting funded, and we're clearly seeing that. Almost every other day, we see some sort of a new announcement of a different type of a L2 that people are building. Obviously, Stacks is, I think, by far the furthest along in terms of maturity or traction or developers or market cap or whatever sort of like metric people care about. But there are definitely other L2s that are emerging, and I'm not counting Lightning, right? Because Lightning is such a different type of a L2. Obviously, it also has a lot of developers. Actually, the Electric Capital report came out. Since in the time that we haven't done this, we should do this more frequently. Where Lightning and Stacks were sort of like leading in terms of developer growth in L2s, and then followed by Rootstock and others, right? So clearly emerging that Lightning and Stacks are two of the bigger ones, but Lightning is just focused on payments, right? There aren't any smart contracts. There isn't the full VM that a lot of people sort of like expect if you're used to building on Solana or Ethereum and so on. But another interesting chart, speaking of growth of L2s, is that there's a very interesting chart in the Electric Capital report that says that it's basically shows the increase in the number of developers who are working on L2s. And now it has reached around 40% of all developers that are working in Bitcoin. So it's a clear growth pattern, but I think that would be a very interesting flipping in a way, that there are more developers working on Bitcoin L2s than are working directly on L1. And that to me is actually writing on the wall. I do think most activity is actually going to be through L2s on Bitcoin. Most people would even interact with BTC through L2s and not sort of like on L1, especially given where the fees are going. L1 becomes more of a cold storage type of a thing, and L2s are your hot wallet or actual, fast, cheap payments that people want to do. And I think definitely the map is becoming more clear now, and people can more clearly see that this is where the world is heading. And I think if anything, it's a sort of like a validation of the early ideas that people in the Stacks community had, and we're pushing forward.
All right, thank you. Now, diving deeper into developments in the Stacks Bitcoin layer 2, Where do we stand with the Nakamoto release, and essentially how are things looking on the ground with core development, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think I've maybe touched on these topics in a previous Stacker chat as well. So Stacks is a very decentralized ecosystem, right? It's not the case where there's one entity like Solana Labs that is primarily responsible for all the development, and then a lot of other people sort of like contribute a little bit. Over here, there is no sort of like single core entity, right? Like if you remember, there was an explicit decentralization process. Early team members went off and sort of like did their own things. I, for example, I'm the CEO of Trust Machines, which is a relatively new entity. Almost like 2 years ago, we raised capital, and we mostly focus on applications, but we see our business interest in contributing to infrastructure as well. But that's not our primary role at all, right? Like we are here to build applications. So one of the biggest sort of challenges that I saw in the open source development for the Stacks L2 was the classic like tragedy of the commons, right? The open source code is common good, everyone benefits from it, but no single sort of like person or entity is really responsible for, hey, who's actually going to maintain that? And that's a pretty real problem, right? Like, and you have to sort of like get alignment from people, and people are well-meaning, like individual developers and everyone sort of like means well, but it's a collective action problem that what direction do people want to go in, and sort of like, what's the most important work, what are the timelines, how do you keep people accountable, and so on. So I think the sort of like big lesson there was that decentralization doesn't mean that you're disorganized, right? Like you could be a well-organized, well-functioning open source project, but you're not dependent on any single organization, because there's so many different organizations and people and open source contributors who are able to join, and you're public, right? Anyone in the world can join and sort of like move it forward. So that was sort of like a learning, a process. We tried this like working group model. I think we had to tweak it a couple of times before it really started working and gelling. And then we started noticing, different silos emerging. Like imagine it's hard enough to build complicated distributed systems in a company, right? If everybody was working for the same company, it's hard enough to do these things. And now if there are information silos, if communication is breaking down. So a lot of like, actually, I would call them soft issues. They're not even like, hey, the hard work of actually, designing these systems and building them and pushing code. A lot of soft issues around coordination, slicing up things, scoping tasks, and in some ways like basic things, right? But in a decentralized environment, it becomes very hard. So I'm very happy to see that the ecosystem has matured a lot. The working groups have solidified. There are much better processes. And it shows that when new developers are quickly able to onboard and able to catch up and understand, like what is the scope of this SIP, the Stacks Improvement Proposal, they are able to write new code and get it merged, right? So that's a big sort of like win, that new developers can onboard quickly, people understand what's going on, communication is better. It feels like the working group was like more like a team, a global decentralized team, but a team nonetheless. So that was great to see. In terms of more specifics, where we stand is, and this is like the product of a working group, right? So anyone can participate, and I'm just describing what the current roadmaps and sort of like status of work is for the working group. And there are effectively the release is divided into two hard forks. One is the Nakamoto hard fork, which is effectively the faster blocks plus other improvements, right? Like you get Bitcoin security, Bitcoin Finality, a bunch of other improvements, but at a high level, it's the faster blocks and the new consensus that gives like Bitcoin Finality. And the other one is SBDC, which is how do you move the Bitcoin asset from L1 to L2? How do you get L2 BTC basically, which we call SBDC on the Stacks L2? That's the division. The SBDC work is well scoped out, progress made, but the focus is right now on Nakamoto, right? And over there, the projected timelines are effectively before the halving, and the focus is there are a bunch of different testnets. So the Neon testnet was already met on time. That was projected for end of December. Super exciting that basic testnet Neon with some very basic functionality actually went live. The next one is Argon, which I personally consider that to be sort of like where the bulk of the work is, because what's happening is that there are individual components that are built. Let's say the threshold wallet system that works on the L1, or DKG signing, or the new consensus sort of like rules and all the different components, but all of them are coming together now. And when that happens, basically, you find out sort of like new things that you haven't really thought about, because now all these different things need to work together. But B, that's the real test as well. Now the system is sort of like coming together in its full form. So that's Argon. That's ongoing. And I think there's some sort of a Argon testnet that might scheduled to go live in February sometime. For me personally, that is the biggest sort of like engineering thing to get done. Like once Argon is done, I mostly think it's just testing into the halving, whenever that is. Projection is like around end of April or something like that for halving, but it sort of like keeps moving, right? So that's where we are. Overall, looking really good, feeling great that the open source developers are gelling, working as a team. We've already hit the Neon milestone. Now we are laser focused on the Argon milestone, and Argon is sort of like the big one in my view. If you meet Argon, then it's basically testing and taking the system live.
All right, thank you. Well, all eyes on Argon, and everything moving ahead. Now, there have been some questions, and can you share a little bit more on the mechanism for stacks following Bitcoin finality, and what the sort of end user experience will be there?
Sure. So I think end user experience is like super important, right? Like that's one of the biggest reasons why even the work on Nakamoto started. Like our realization was sort of, as people are getting more and more used to fast UX on Solana or some of the other systems, and we are going towards like mass market, like the Web2 scale type of users, they would expect that type of functionality from Bitcoin as well. And I think Bitcoin L1 is never going to give them that sort of functionality. It's going to be slow and it's going to be expensive, right? Bitcoin fees are going up, if anything, by a lot over the last year. So I think it's really the Bitcoin L2s that need to deliver on the fast, cheap Bitcoin UX. And I personally think that a lot of the new users are going to interact with BTC mostly on the L2, right? Like L1 is sort of like a cold storage, and L2 is where most of the action happens, and there might be multiple L2s. So with that in mind, I think some of the goal here with Nakamoto launch is, can we have faster blocks, give people some sort of like confirmations on their fast blocks with a security model, and then as soon as a Bitcoin block comes, try to follow Bitcoin finality. So we made like tons of progress there. Like for example, when the original Nakamoto paper came out, again, it was sort of like joint work in the working group. There are no authors listed on the paper. We were looking at achieving Bitcoin finality in something like 100 to 150 Bitcoin blocks. The design have been iterated upon and improved, and I'm super excited about it. Now we're talking about getting to Bitcoin finality as soon as when Bitcoin gets finality, right? So if most people consider Bitcoin to be final at like 5 or 6 blocks, some people are even fine with like 3 confirmations or 2 confirmations, whatever is your definition of, because it's probabilistic, whatever probability you're fine with, the L2 is going to basically follow that, right? And that's a very, very sort of like strong guarantee to have, and a great UX as well. So I think the UX that would look like would be, let's say there are 2 people like me and you. I'm old school. I'm just going to use the L1, and you sort of have, your Leather or Xverse wallets that support the L2, and you want to do the transaction on the L2. So the difference that we would notice is I will do the L1 transaction, let's say from Electrum. Let's say I'm just paying BTC to somebody, and now I'm waiting for a confirmation. And I had to pay a very high gas fee because L1 fees are much higher. You, on the other hand, did the L2 transaction on Stacks. The fees are much, much cheaper. And within seconds, you got a confirmation that this thing went through. Now, it's important to understand, what does that confirmation mean? So I think the best analogy for understanding what that confirmation means is it's very similar to the type of confirmation you get on Ethereum or Solana, where people have capital lock So in Ethereum, people have ETH locked, and they are validators who sign off on the block. Same as Solana, right? People have capital locked and they sign off on the block. Today, Stacks has something like $600 million locked, and in the future it might be more. But it's very similar. They are validators. They have signed off on the block, and now for someone to reverse it, it's basically they need more economic power and take over the 500, $600 million that are locked. So I think pretty good security for your transaction. So within seconds, you're like, oh, I got the confirmation. I'm so done. I paid low fees and I'm good. While I'm on the L1, I'm still waiting, right? Like, hey, is my transaction getting in? Is it not getting in? And as soon as a Bitcoin block comes, let's say my transaction also gets in on the L1. Now the finality for both is actually sort of similar, right? But specifically in terms of reorg, for someone to reorg that transaction, they would have to reorg Bitcoin, right? So you can't, Stacks miners can no longer reorg anything, right? Like you would have to go and reorg Bitcoin to be able to like make those changes, and that's a very, I think, interesting property to have. Now, I think if you dig a little bit deeper there, there are some corner cases that are worth exploring, right? So the first thing is that Bitcoin sort of like reorgs or forks. People call them orphans as well, right? Like some block gets orphaned. So let's say a miner started building off not the latest block, but the one before it. And then that chain became the dominant one. So there will be at some point an orphan block that will get lost, right? So this orphans have traditionally been sort of like going down in Bitcoin. These days, the latest stats are it happens like once a week, right? But still it happens, right? There's a Bitcoin block where your transaction got in, you thought it got in, but then it got orphaned, and there's a different block that your transaction needs to get.